اللهم يا كريم أكرمنا بنور الفهم وأخرجنا من ظلمات الوهم ولا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله. O Allah, the noble, the generous, we ask you to ennoble us with the light of understanding and to remove us from the shadows of illusion. And there is no power nor might except through God. Ameen. Assalamu alaikum. Welcome. Welcome, guys. So we usually do these classes before iftar. And just as a PSA, that is going to resume next week, starting Tuesday. Daylight savings threw us off a little bit this year. But we will go back to our normal schedule starting Tuesday. Inshallah, these classes will be before iftar. But I'm going to be doing a series on Saturday nights, inshallah, called Ramadan in the End Times. And I have to say, this is the first time in a while that I've taught something that actually scares me a little bit. All right? This topic, it sounds very heavy, and I guess in some ways it is a heavy topic. But I think that there is a lot of optimism that we can draw from diving in to what we're going to be discussing over the coming weeks, which is the signs of the hour. The reason I picked this is because I have noticed through the work that I do here at Ta'leef and talking to a lot of the people in our communities that we are speaking in ways about the world around us that is new, like as a community. And I think it's very important that we put the right words and the right names to the things that we are talking about so that we can actually have intelligent and meaningful conversations. And what I mean about this is really ever since the events in Gaza kicked off on October 7th, the way in which we talked about that conflict differed from the way that we talked about previous conflicts in Gaza. Now, many of you probably remember, like, we've had many Ramadans in the past couple of decades where Israel has been bombing the people of Gaza during Ramadan. All right? I remember this was probably 10 years ago. I forget the exact year, but we had a very, very somber Eid, right? Because the conflict there was ongoing, and while it was a day of celebration, we all felt a heaviness. And yet, when we spoke about that conflict, we still talked in very conventional terms about it. We talked about like the history that led up to the conflict, the geopolitical implications of that conflict. We talked in the way that the news talked about it. But what I've noticed in the past 15 months, which is how long this thing has been going on, and it has resumed, if you've been paying attention to the news, it has resumed, is that now we are asking what I can only describe as much larger questions. We are now asking questions about the basic nature of good and evil in this world. And specifically, like, how evil can be perpetrated so openly, so unapologetically, without any sort of apparent backlash against it. Jazakallah khair. We're asking ourselves questions about, like, why are the forces of good seemingly so impotent against the forces of evil? And we're asking questions like, well, like, how exactly can a situation like this continue on? Like, how does the world go on its present course? It becomes very difficult to imagine a future in which we continue on this path for another 5 years or another 10 years. And I think what we are asking ourselves at the end of the day are ultimately eschatological questions. Eschatology being the study or the knowledge of the end of time. And what that means for us as Muslims is the revealed knowledge that we receive from the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam about the signs of the hour. And so I've been hearing conversations, and I've been participating in conversations, some that name it as a conversation about the signs of the hour, some that don't. But I wanted to put that name to it. So then inshallah we have some common frame of reference for the things that we are thinking and the things that we are talking about as a community. Now this is new. I mentioned that. I really think this is new. Discussions of the signs of the hour used to be sort of like a fringe topic in our communities. Like, are any of you like old enough to be familiar with the arrivals? Raise your hand if you know the arrivals. Okay, like a few people, right? Like if you want like a little like fun thing to do tonight when you get home after Taraweeh, like go on YouTube and search for the arrivals. You're gonna see some wild stuff. This is like a series of videos on like the signs of the hour. But I remember like 10 years ago, if you brought up the arrivals in like any sort of like mainstream setting, people would give you side eye. Like it'd be like, why are you bringing this up? Now we're in a space where I think this is a conversation that we as a community are getting more comfortable with. And so I think it's very important that we talk about it as a community. Now, what I want to do this week is I just want to simply relate two hadith to you and discuss them a little bit. And the first one really, what it does is it tells us that whatever discussion we may have about the signs of the hour, we are not in a position to make specific claims to predict when it will be, but that we ought to know that we are already in the middle of it. We live in an age that is going to be filled with signs of the hour. And what this hadith says is the Prophet ﷺ said to his companions that the advent of my mission and the hour are like these two. He said, "Bu'ithtu wa sa'ata kahataini," and he held his index and his middle finger up like this. He pointed with them. Meaning like his mission and the hour, they're like this. They go together, right? Like when you say to someone like, yeah, like me and my boy here, we're like this. It's like, you see me, you're probably gonna see him, right? We come as a package together. What the Prophet ﷺ is telling us is that his mission as a prophet is the first sign of the hour. Meaning that everything that comes after him is going to be like the period of time in which we are going to be witnessing these signs. So I don't want anyone to get confused or to think that we're doing anything special here tonight by saying we are in the time where we are going to be witnessing signs of the hour. This is something that I am not claiming, right? This is something that he told us. And if he told us something, we can be certain of it. All right. Now, before I go on to the second hadith, I want to ask, do we have anyone in here visiting Ta'leef for the first time in, like, let's say the past month? Okay, good. Some people. Are you guys looking into Islam for the first time? Raise your hand if that's the case for you. Okay. So everyone here is a Muslim, is that correct? Okay. I'm looking for the hands that were just raised. Everyone here is a Muslim. Okay, so I'm asking because I want to know your familiarity with the hadith of Jibreel. Are you guys familiar with this hadith? Okay, so there may be parts that I gloss over just a little bit. If there's something that I gloss over and you're like, wait, hold on, I don't understand what you're talking about, raise your hand and let me know. Because I want to make sure that we're not leaving anyone behind here. So the hadith of Jibreel. This is a hadith that anyone learning the religion for the very first time is very likely to hear. Because what it does is it lays out the main points of our religion for us. And it's an amazing hadith in the sense that something very strange happens that leads up to the hadith that we have with us today. And this hadith is narrated to us by Omar, may God be pleased with him, who was sitting with the Prophet ﷺ. And he says that one day, as we were sitting with the Messenger of God, a man came into our gathering. And this man had no signs of travel on him, though he was wearing very white clothes. There was no dust on his clothing. There was no dust in his hair. His hair was very black. And yet, none of us knew him. This is a strange thing. And I feel like I have to explain this to city folk sometimes. I come from a small town. This made perfect sense to me when I first heard it, because I come from a small town, like Medina, right? In a small town, everyone knows everyone, right? So you're at like your favorite local restaurant in a small town, and someone you don't know walks into the restaurant, like they're from out of town, right? This is what was happening here, right? He definitely didn't look like a traveler, and yet none of us knew him. So immediately everyone is kind of like, what is going on? And the situation just keeps getting stranger. The man comes and sits with so the Prophet ﷺ was sitting the way that we sit in prayer, right? And the man comes and sits and puts his knees right up against the knees of the Messenger of God, and he puts his hands on his knees. Very familiar. And Omar, you guys know Omar. He's like the ride or die, okay? He's like ready to stand up and take the head of anyone who gets too close to the Prophet, who might be maybe trying to harm him, might be trying to disrespect him. Omar was very, very defensive over the Messenger of God. But he sees that the Prophet is calm. And then it gets even stranger. The man says, "O Muhammad," right? What do they call him? Rasulullah, right? They're very respectful, very deferential to him. Who is this stranger who walks in and says, "O Muhammad," right? Very familiar. And he says, "Inform me of Islam." And the Prophet ﷺ says, Islam is to testify that there is nothing worthy of worship except God, and that Muhammad is the messenger of God. It is to pray the prayer, to give the annual zakah, it's to fast in Ramadan, and it is to go on the Hajj if you're able to do so. And the man says, again, very strangely, "You're correct." And Omar is sitting there wondering, like, who is this guy confirming what the message, like whenever the Prophet ﷺ would ask his companions questions, more often than not, they would respond to him with, "Allah and His Messenger know best," right? And this man is telling him, "You're right." Like, I know better than you do. So it's a weird scene, very out of the ordinary. Then he says, "Inform me of Iman." And the Prophet ﷺ says, Iman is to believe in Allah, His angels, His books, His messengers, the divine decree, and the day of judgment. And he says, "You're correct." Then he says, "Inform me of ihsan." And the Prophet ﷺ says, ihsan is to worship God as if you see Him. And though you cannot see Him, to know that He sees you. And then he says, "Inform me of the hour." And the Prophet ﷺ says, "The one questioned knows no more than the questioner." Meaning, this is knowledge that only resides with Allah. It's not something that I have access to. It's not something that you have access to. It's not something that anyone will ever have access to. That belongs to Allah. And so the man says, "Okay, tell me about its signs." And the Prophet ﷺ tells him two things. He says that the slave girl will give birth to her mistress, and that you will see the barefoot, naked, destitute herdsmen competing in the construction of lofty buildings. The second one, I think, is pretty self-explanatory nowadays when you look at cities like Dubai and Mecca, right? And at that point, the man says, "You've spoken correctly," and he leaves. And there are different narrations of this hadith. In some, the Prophet immediately turns to Omar. In some, actually quite some time passes where they're sitting in silence. But eventually, the Prophet ﷺ turns to Omar and he says, "Oh, Omar, do you know who that was?" And Omar says what they often say, "Allah and His Messenger know best." And the Prophet responds, "That was Jibreel, who came to teach you your religion." Okay, so we get one very important lesson for us tonight from this hadith, which is that the signs of the end of time are a part of our religion. They are right there, baked in, just as important as our acts of worship, our creed, and our spirituality. The signs of the end of time are something that we have to know about. When I explain this hadith to people, very often what I like to tell them is that what the Prophet ﷺ is laying out here is actually a formula for doing anything well, not just being a Muslim. You look at any task that you have to perform, whether it's in your job or as a parent or whatever the case may be, you actually need all of the elements that you have here in the hadith of Jibreel, right? First, you need to practice the outward actions of that task. You have to be good at it. And I often liken this, because this is an analogy that rings very true, very strong for me, because I grew up on an island. I liken it to surfing. You want to be a surfer. I mean, the first thing you have to do is you have to get out there and you have to practice. Oh, mashallah. He is so cute, by the way. Mashallah. You bring him back when he's done. I like seeing him in the crowd. You want to be a surfer. You have to practice surfing, right? You actually have to get out there in the waves and you have to try to get up on that board and ride the waves, right? But you can't just get out there and blindly do actions, right? You actually have to have some form of knowledge as well, which is what we have with Iman. Iman is like the content of our knowledge when it comes to this faith. You have to know that God is real. You have to know that His angels and His books and His messengers are real. You have to know that the divine decree is a reality and that one day we will stand before God in judgment. These are things that you have to know. Similarly, if you want to surf, you have to know about the tides. You have to know about undertows, right? You can get out there and seriously hurt or even kill yourself if you don't have the right knowledge when you're out in the middle of the ocean. And when you put these two things together, when you have knowledge and action together, oftentimes when you get really good at putting those two things together, you get ihsan. You have these sublime moments where everything just comes together. Oftentimes we talk about this as a state of flow, right? Where it almost feels like you are not even present for the things that you're doing. It's like the actions are running through you. Have you guys had this experience with anything that you're really good at? Sometimes when you see a person in this state, it's awe-inspiring, right? And I've felt that. I'm not a surfer myself, but I've watched surfers. You ever watched someone ride a really big wave? And it's like, wow. I mean, like, this person is just like in the moment. And it's almost like they're a part of the wave itself. That's ihsan. That's excellence. This word can be translated as excellence, but also as beauty, right? Because the two things go hand in hand. Watching someone do something that they are excellent at is a beautiful thing to watch. I'm going to extend this metaphor tonight because usually I leave the metaphor right there with Islam, Iman, and Ihsan. But I think we can extend it to the signs of the hour. Right? If you get out there and try to surf on a calm day, you're not going to be able to do it. If you're going to surf, you have to know, generally speaking, like what time it is for the ocean. And it would be silly for a surfer to think, man, I hope the ocean isn't too like volatile today. No, actually what you need as a surfer is you need volatility. You need wind. You maybe, like in some cases, you need a storm off the coast whipping up those waves. Because if you don't have that, you're not going to be able to get out there and do anything. You're just going to be sitting on your board. What the signs of the hours, they introduce the element of time into our understanding of this religion. They tell us exactly when we are. And in knowing when we are, we know what everything else in that hadith is there to do. It's preparing us for the moment in which we live. Right? Like this is the end point of the hadith. It ends with the signs of the hour. You might say that that is the khatam. It's the seal of this hadith. Really, like that's the whole point of this hadith. And if we think about it, why do we need to know this specific piece of knowledge about the signs of the hour as a part of our religion? Like, what is Allah and what is Allah's messenger telling us in including this information into the knowledge of our religion? Because this is what it is. This is what the Prophet ﷺ says at the end. That was Jibreel who came to teach you your religion. What he's telling us is that this religion that Allah has given to us, the prayers, the fasting, the zakah, the pilgrimage, it was purpose made to get you through this period of history when the signs of the hour are going to become more and more apparent. Right? Humanity did not have salah in the way that we have it today until the coming of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Allah did not give it to us until His coming because we did not need it until His coming. The same is true of all of our worship. The same is true of our particular formation of our creed. These are the things that we need to know and understand as people who are going to be living through these signs. And this ought to give us a lot of encouragement, I think. Because while Allah is telling us, yeah, you're going to live through this very volatile period. You're going to live in a time where this storm is going to brew and it's going to get more and more intense. He is also telling us, I've given you the tools to deal with it. And so I think first and foremost what we can do is make that a part of our intention in our worship. That yes, like I am worshiping because, like the time for the Maghrib prayer has come in and it's just time to pray. And I'm going to be obedient to Allah. But also, I'm going to pray this prayer as a means of preparing my heart to live in the time that Allah put me in. And what I hope that this can cultivate for us is what I would like to refer to as a warrior's optimism, right? Because this stuff should not scare us. It should not get us down. And you know, people who have seen the title of this series have come to me and said, well, like, why are you doing such like a heavy, depressing topic? Well, it's not meant to be heavy and depressing. Maybe it's meant to be heavy, but I hope that, inshallah, it can be uplifting for us to recognize that Allah has given us everything that we need to navigate this time that we live in, right? And I want to give you an example of what I mean. I watched this movie recently for the first time. It's called Fury. Has anybody seen Fury? Great movie. Great movie. It's with Brad Pitt, Shia LaBeouf, that guy who's in The Punisher. What's his name? John something? You guys know who I'm talking about? Great movie. It's a World War II movie. And these guys are tank operators. Like, they ride around in a tank fighting the Germans in this movie. And they keep having like these near misses with death. And every time they have this near miss, they say this thing to each other. It's the best job I've ever had. Right? It's like, we almost just died. Man, this is the best job I've ever had. That's a warrior's optimism. It's like, yeah, we're out here. We're in the thick of it. We are at the front of the war. But this is the best job I've ever had. I wouldn't want to be anywhere else. Right? That is accepting the place that God has put you in with a sense of cheerfulness. Right? And I'm not going to spoil the end of the movie because I'd actually like all of you to go watch it. But they keep saying this to the very end. I'll say that much. They say this to the very end. Best job I've ever had. And that's where I want us to be, inshallah. With what we are going to discuss in the coming weeks, that not this is something that is getting us down, but that we are looking around us and we're seeing the signs. And we're saying, I'm exactly where Allah put me. And I have a sense of confidence because I know that Allah has given me the tools to ride this wave, right? Like, I'm not going to drown. No, like, I'm going to get up on my board and I'm going to ride this wave. And I'm going to be grateful for the volatility, the storm that Allah has put me in the middle of that is giving me these waves to ride, inshallah. So this week is going to be short because we are short on time. And I want to leave some time for Q&A. We'll leave it there, and then we're actually going to get into a bit more depth in the coming weeks, inshallah. So if there's any questions, any comments, anything that you have, bismillah. Manny, I see you back there.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Yes, so for the two signs, and what you said, we're all aware of the Bedouin desert people building skyscrapers. Have been happy for the last 60, 70 years. But how about the first, the mother giving, or I forgot, but the first part of the hadith, basically, the first part.
Yeah, so the first part of that was that the slave girl will give birth to her mistress. And, you know, this is, like, I think the second one is quite literal. The first one, you know, is open to more interpretation. But from what I have heard from my own teachers is that this really is probably referring to, like, the inversion of principles, right? Whereas, you know, children, generally speaking, ought to serve their parents. Right? So, you know, the parent gives birth to their, and if we're going to use the exact same terminology, their slave girl, right? Or their servant. The parents give birth to children who serve them, right? That's the natural order of things. Because what are you doing in having your children serve you? Like, you're teaching them things like adab. You're teaching them things like, you know, performing tasks that are actually going to serve them later in life. That's the natural order of things. But that the slave girl will give birth to her mistress is saying, like, the mother is going to be the slave girl and she is going to serve her daughter. It's the inversion of that principle. And taken more literally, this could be seen to mean that, parents will not have control over their children anymore. And I think certainly that is something that we see quite often, that the obedience of children to their parents is something that I certainly remember being more of a rule when, and I see some heads nodding, it was more of a rule when I was coming up, and it seems to be less of a rule now. I get frustrated as a parent, oftentimes seeing the way that some other parents parent, where they're like consulting their children on what they want to do. It's like, do you want to go home now? Like, are you feeling sleepy? Like, we can do what you want. And I'm like, I honestly, like, it low-key makes me a little bit upset, because I'm like, because my kids are sitting here watching this, and they're like, why are you bossing me around all the time? Why don't you ask me? And I just shoot them a look like, you better stay in line, because we're not doing that in my house, right? But you see this, right? But more generally, it is probably speaking to a greater inversion of principles, where like everything that we know and everything that resonates with our fitra, our innate human nature, is getting flipped on its head, right? And I think we see that all around us. I don't need to go into too many examples about what that looks like. I think we can look around and see many of those examples. So that's the interpretation that I have heard, that I think is probably the strongest that I've heard. And certainly there could be more. Yeah, Wayakum. Yes, ma'am.
Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam.
So, in the hadith, Prophet ﷺ mentioned 2 signs, but I remember hearing like at least a dozen of all of them. So I guess 2-part question. Number 1, where do the other ones come from? And number 2, I think that one thing that's really stood out to me in the past 15 months is the Muslims' like complete clarity in knowing that Palestine will be free. And I also feel like I remember hearing something about the end of times related to Al-Aqsa and Palestine. So